I'm joined by Ann Richard. Ann, thank you for being with us today. The fellows loved your presentation, as you could tell by the many that wouldn't let you go at the end of the time.
It's a wonderful audience.
Thank you. So, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres gave his charge at the beginning of the year, and he noted that the world had gone in reverse. In fact, he issued a red alert to the world, citing conflicts that have deepened, global anxieties that have grown over nuclear weapons, and inequities that have grown in nationalism and xenophobia that are on the rise. Given his assessment, what are your hopes for how the SDGs might be realized?
Well, first I should say I have a tremendous amount of respect and actually affection for Antonio Guterres because he was the High Commissioner for Refugees for 10.5 years. Exactly. I met him very soon after he took office. He's a former Portuguese Prime Minister. He's a brilliant, brilliant man, and we worked very closely together, including traveling to refugee crises together when I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. So I think he has a very realistic understanding of the challenges around the world. I think he's trying to do several things. One is to reform the United Nations agencies so that they work better together as a team. There's been a lot of rhetoric about doing that, but he's really trying to move all his colleagues, people he's known for years now, to work in the most efficient way possible because the list of problems is so daunting. And then the other thing he needs to do is corral all of the UN member states. And I think his predecessors were able to depend on the United States as a top ally. And from time to time, we have also been a top headache for the United Nations. And I think right now, we are somewhat of an unreliable top donor to the UN. And that's too bad, given the list of things he's contending with, given the fact that the world came together behind the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, to really make some progress in helping people around the world. You know, we really have a very smart, well thought out plan on how to do that and a lot of buy-in. But the US right now is being very unpredictable in how we are behaving. And I think that's probably a headache for him.
So if I could just follow up about Nikki Haley's recent announcement that we were going to take names of individuals who didn't vote our way around the decision around Jerusalem. Would you comment on that kind of statement coming from our own UN ambassador?
Diplomacy tends to be something that requires a deep understanding of history, of geography, of circumstances, demography, what works and what doesn't work in foreign policy. Over time, Americans have tried very hard not to bully other countries, but instead to influence. Of course, we have the world's largest army. We have the world's largest military. We try to avoid deploying it. It's much cheaper, more effective, in some ways more rewarding to be able to accomplish things using diplomacy and our influence, which is substantial, instead of really using pressure, blackmail, threats, bullying. This is something that Madeleine Albright, who gives her name to this institute at her alma mater, knows full well because she was not only Secretary of State, she was also ambassador to the United Nations. Sometimes what I found is that these kind of tactics do work short term, but I think we end up pushing away potential allies, turning off potential friends by that kind of bluster and behavior that sometimes is being voiced by Trump administration officials. You know, we were talking this morning about U.S. leadership on humanitarian assistance, and I'm pleased that Ambassador Haley has gone to Jordan and met with refugees. She's gone to South Sudan and met with displaced people living in camps for their own safety. she's gone to the Congo. This is, really very promising. Her predecessor, Samantha Power, had already had years of experience in those places. Nikki Haley had been governor of South Carolina. So this is a new world for her. But the fact that she has chosen to go visit and talk to people and educate herself about this, that's the flip side. That's a promising signal, I think.
It's very heartening.
Yeah.
So speaking of diplomacy, our Secretary Albright has talked about the state of the State Department as one of crisis. Can you talk to us about your understanding of the current configuration of the State Department and what that bodes for U.S. diplomacy?
I joined the U.S. government in 1984, and for a while I was a civil servant. And so I worked for Republican and Democratic administrations and saw the transitions from one party to another in the White House. And I have always tried to work in a very bipartisan basis, even after I chose to work directly for Secretary Albright on foreign aid funding, and I became a political appointee to do that. And so I have always tried to forge and have good relations with both sides of the political aisle, look for people who would agree, be champions on providing assistance, whether that is Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who was a Cuban refugee from Miami and a Republican, or Chris Smith of New Jersey, who cared about what was happening in Africa, or Bob Corker of Tennessee, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, cares about what's happening in the rest of the world. So I expected certain things to happen with the change from a Democratic to a Republican administration. I'm quite shocked by the way the Trump administration has come into the State Department. A lot of offices are empty, a lot of poor morale. The secretary has focused on redesign without really starting with a vision of where he wants to go. He's brought in a couple of firms that didn't know a lot about the State Department to do it. Some quick off-the-mark announcements about cutting funding for the UN Population Fund, which has been done by previous administrations, but also threats to aid for Palestinian refugees that provide education and health care to people in the Middle East. Taking that away does not help the situation in the Middle East. My office, that I cared very much about, they have not gotten a new assistant secretary. No one has been nominated to do that. Whole offices in the State Department stand empty.
So are you saying no one has replaced the role that you were in?
There is a Foreign Service officer, a very capable person who was my deputy, acting in the role that I had. But he's not really empowered by virtue of being part of a team to move in different directions. You also have a lot of activity early on that's anti-refugee, coming out of the White House, coming out of the Domestic Policy Council led by Stephen Miller. The travel ban that was so disruptive was released on day 7 of the administration, caught people in mid-flight, and it affected a lot of international travelers, but it especially hurt refugees who are among some of the most vulnerable people on earth. And journalists were told that the experts had been consulted and they had not been consulted. So I see a lot of things of concern to me that has nothing to do with the policies. It's more about how it's being carried out in a way that's not professional, not respectful to the people that work there, and not smart for the United States in how we carry out our foreign policy.
So just to follow up, do you attribute this shift in the way the State Department is configured as an intentional disregard for diplomacy or a lack of understanding of the role of diplomacy? To what do you attribute these changes?
I think the Trump administration was unable to take advantage of some of the real Republican foreign policy experts, because so many of them had signed letters against candidate Trump that they took themselves out of contention for jobs in his administration. So you get a lot of folks coming in who don't have the kind of backgrounds that would be useful. You always get new people coming in who don't have extensive backgrounds, but you try to get a mix of some folks who have served in previous administrations, whether that's Reagan or George Herbert Walker Bush or George W. Bush. You know, there are people in think tanks in Washington and in the private sector who have come in and out of jobs with different Republican administrations who appreciate the nuances of U.S. foreign policy and the breadth of things undertaken by the U.S. Department of State. And so there are not a large number of people coming into state. It's taking a while. And some of the people we've seen in testimony to Congress, people up for ambassadorships, they really don't know much about what the jobs they're trying to go for. And so, you know, there's always a balance in ambassadorships between the people who know the president well or have a good sense of issues that matter to the heartland of America.
Yes.
So I'm not saying that every candidate has to fit a mold, but they have to be professionals who lend something of value to our U.S. foreign policy, our international relations. And we've seen some of the names of people who have come forward have been distressing.
What advice would you give our fellows who are considering a career in public service, who may be having second or third thoughts at this?
I get asked this question a lot, and I tell them to try to go into public service. Don't turn off from that. Take the Foreign Service exam, even if hiring is temporarily frozen or if jobs are far and few between. We're going to need smart people in the future to fill those senior ranks, and the best people will have gotten experience earlier on in their career. So not to be completely turned off from careers as foreign service officers or as civil servants in the U.S. government. The main thing is to find offices where there's a policy you're working on or a program you're working on that you believe in, and that you're surrounded by really smart, capable bosses, and to avoid perhaps working on programs, even if you're offered a position where you have a personal problem with the policy.
One last question.
Sure.
These women are coming of age at a time when there's heightened awareness of gender, the Me Too movement, and much of the activity that occurred before the Me Too movement. Do you have advice for them about gender in the workplace and how they may want to conduct themselves or have a special awareness?
The Me Too movement has, I think, raised a lot of questions and sort of churn for many of us, even people who have had successful careers in bureaucracies and in organizations. You know, like Madeleine Albright, I have tried to mentor and bring along young women, but I've also been in meetings where I'm the only woman in the room. Mm-hmm. Still, you know, in certain parts of the world, I'm definitely the only woman in the world. Sometimes it's just based on subject matter or luck of the draw. So I think that we're helped by the fact that this is an open conversation now, and that social media can play actually a positive role in surfacing some of the challenges and the difficulties that I regret to say are still being confronted by women in lots of different workplaces and lots of different sectors of the economy. I don't feel particularly expert on giving advice about this, actually. I think that for me, it's still a work in progress. And I'm sort of embarrassed, too. I don't know how you feel. I'm embarrassed, too, that young women have to, at this day and age, contend with some of the same problems that date, you know, that in previous decades were sort of taken as a given that men could harass women in the workplace. I'm embarrassed that that's still the case today.
Well, I can say that the fellows are particularly fortunate that they have you to look to as an example of whom they may want to become.
Oh, that's really nice to hear.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.